PowerPoint, and the PowerPoint up here on the church laptop is absolutely refusing to kick into slide mode on this. So every time I kick on it, or try to kick it into slide mode, it just locks up. So I'll try to go ahead and just show the slides up here. You know, they'll be a little small, they'll be a little odd, but if we can make it through, fine. If not, I'll just go ahead and talk. So, anyway, when I was first asked or tasked to do the study of the prophet Daniel and how his life and ministry pointed towards Christ, I was initially a little disappointed, I guess, that we weren't comparing Daniel and Joseph. Because when you think about it, it's almost a shoo-in in a way. Because, I mean, yeah, a teenage man is taken in captivity to a foreign land where he gets into the good graces of the local potentate because of his God-given wisdom to interpret dreams. You know, some of you have heard this story before, right? So, you know, there's a significant difference, there's several significant differences between Joseph and Daniel as well. So, we've been studying for the last several, the poor bear drinking milk in a snowstorm slide. Sorry, guys. Are any of these going to show up? Oh, yeah. All right, I guess I'm just going to have to wing it without the slides. Sorry. So we've been studying this time in these circumstances for the last several months during the Wednesday night class here in the main auditorium with Gene. So if you've been there, a lot of today's lesson will be all tapped to you, but then this is all kind of something doing that same story arc that we've been in for the last couple of months in here anyway. So due to a variety of historical sources, Daniel's lifetime can be nailed down with unusual precision. In circumstances in which both secular and biblical histories converge, we can nail down the beginnings of Daniel the man to sometime between 620 and 625 BC. He was born into a Middle East that was almost as much of a hotbed of political feuds and war as the Middle East of today. As we'll see below, he was of royal and noble descent, and that was from Daniel chapter 1, verse 3. And even Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian, notes that Daniel and Ananias, Mishael and Azarias were from the family of Zedekiah, the king. So he was from noble and royal blood. And as we've seen over the last several lessons, the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, has already ceased to exist at this point as a going concern. And the kingdom of Judah is essentially trying to decide if it wants to be a client state of Egypt or a client state of Babylon. And it ends out trying to play the part of the 8-year-old who was trying to play the parents one off against the other. And it fails pretty miserably. The kingdom of Judah ends out initially being a client state of Egypt. Then Nebuchadnezzar comes over, shakes his fist, and kind of takes over and installs a puppet king in Judah. A few years later, Egypt and Babylon go to war. Babylon's defeated. And so at this point, I think it was Jehoiakim at that point was the one that said, well, since Babylon's defeated, they're not that powerful anymore, we're going to hook back up with Egypt to attempt to defeat Babylon. Babylon said, not quite so fast. So at this point in 605, Daniel's a teenager. Nebuchadnezzar makes his first punitive raid on the kingdom of Judah, and he lays siege to Jerusalem. King Jehoiakim was killed in the battle, and there's nuances there, but the important thing is that by the time the battle is over, so is King Jehoiakim. And Nebuchadnezzar obviously ultimately triumphed, and as part of his conquest, Nebuchadnezzar instructed Athanaz, the master of the eunuchs, effectively the master of the king's household, to find young members of the nobility in Judah who, as is quoted from Daniel chapter 1, first half of verse 4, young men in whom there was no physical defect, who were handsome, well-versed and all kinds of wisdom, well-educated, and having keen insight. So these men were gotten together in a group, and they were the first group that went back to Babylon. And this was done for two reasons. The cream of Jewish nobility was serving in Babylon as hostages against the good behavior of the people still remaining in the kingdom of Judah. So if whoever it was that was on the throne at this point had decided to try to go back to Egypt, these were hostages against that. And the second thing was Nebuchadnezzar was attempting to integrate the Jewish nation, the kingdom of Judah, into Babylon itself, to kind of homogenize and mix them in, to destroy the racial identity or the cultural identity and heritage that the kingdom of Judah had. So in so doing, they were going to be intermarrying with them. They end out basically kind of erasing the history that they had, and they were going to hopefully, from the perspective of the Babylonians, they were hopefully ultimately going to be able to backpopulate Judah with Babylonians at some point in the future. So we have 4 men who were expropriated, I guess, with this initial group that were named by name in the book of Daniel, and the rest of the group was just kind of a formless mass that went along with it. And as part of the journey and as part of being integrated into the king's household, these 4 men ended up receiving new names. And you remember last week, Zeb had told you that he was going to teach you a word of Aramaic. This week we're going to do 3 words of Babylonian. So we have Daniel, who was given the new name of Belteshazzar, which translates to Bel, protect his life, Bel being a reference to the god that Nebuchadnezzar worshipped. Bel protect his life, or possibly Bel protect the king. A little cloudy there. Hananiah became Shadrach, meaning commander of Aku. Mishael became Meshach. I wasn't able to find a good translation of what that meant. And then Azariah became Abednego, meaning servant of Nego. So, one of the things that the elders here in the church, when they kind of came up with this lesson overview, really wanted us to touch on was how much the lives of these prophets and the major historical touch points during the lives of these prophets actually pointed forward towards Christ. There were a lot of things in Daniel's life and in the way he lived that pointed forward in this way. So the first 2 are displayed here almost before the story gets started. So the first one is that, like Jesus, Daniel had a conviction to do what was right and a refusal to compromise in that conviction. Jesus may have known what the word compromise meant, but it was not really in his vocabulary for his own activities. He refused Satan's temptations to compromise during at the end of his 40 days in the wilderness, and he could have compromised in many different ways, even up to the night before he was crucified. When he was on trial with the Sanhedrin, he could have given them, the unequivocal sign that they were looking for. Would they have been willing to accept it at that point? Probably not. But he could have worked things around so that he would not have had to have suffered and died on the cross for us. But that would have been a compromise, and that was just not the way he did business. And so, like Jesus, Daniel was doing much the same thing. In Daniel chapter 1, verses 8 through 16, if you'll want to go ahead and read with me on that. But again, it's Daniel chapter 1, verses 8 through 16. But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with royal delicacies of the royal wine. And actually, kind of backing up to give context to this, as the master of the king's household was taking these men away, part of his orders were to give all of these men the best food, the best wine. Basically they're eating directly off of the king's table as they're going through the best schools to end up being, people of, mid to high level bureaucracies in Babylon, So to do that, they had to be fed the best food, drink the best wine. We wanted no distractions while they learned. Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the royal delicacies or the royal wine. And therefore he asked the overseer of the court officials for permission not to defile himself. And God made the overseer of the court officials sympathetic to Daniel. But he responded to Daniel, I fear the master of the king. He's the one who decided your food and drink. What would happen if he saw you? If you looked malnourished in comparison to the other young men your age. If that happened, you would endanger my life with the king. Daniel then spoke to the warden, whom the overseer of the court officials had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Please test your servants for 10 days. By providing us with some vegetables to eat and water to drink, they compare our appearance with that of the young men who are eating the royal delicacies and deal with us in the light of what you see. So the warden agreed to their proposal and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, their appearance was better and their bodies were healthier than all the young men who had been eating the royal delicacies. So the reasons that this diet would have defiled the four of them was not brought into the text. You could probably suppose there was something about the king's diet that was not in accordance with law either. If it was, maybe the way that the game had been slaughtered, or if there was something else maybe about the, if it had been sacrificed to idols or something like that. Regardless of which, Daniel felt that it would go against God's will and God's law to eat the food and drink the wine. When he brought this request to the overseer was worried that the four of them would fail to thrive, that the overseer would be punished for failing in his task to ensure the health of those four young men. And so Daniel proposed a brief test in which they tried for 10 days and go to the results themselves, go after the results that made themselves visible, which leads us to number 2. That Daniel, because of this conviction in God, he had confidence and faith in the Word of God. The Son of God obviously had faith and confidence in his Father, but that wasn't really faith. Because he lived with God, he knew God, God was his Father. He knew with a knowledge that passed all understanding that his Father was alive and was in heaven. And that he rewarded those who diligently sought him. In John chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, we have John's famous declaration that Jesus was the Word, and the Word who is God. So Daniel's strong faith in the Word manifested itself in a couple of ways here. Remember that the society that Daniel was born into had, for the most part, abandoned God. It was to the point where in Jeremiah chapter 23, verse 14, actually I think we were just there this past Wednesday. The word of the Lord says to Jeremiah, but I see the prophets of Jerusalem doing something just as shocking. They are unfaithful to me and continually prophesy lies. So they give encouragement to the people who are doing evil, with the result that they do not stop their evil doing. I consider all of them as bad as the people of Sodom, and the citizens of Jerusalem as bad as the people of Gomorrah. And that's always, when you get to that point in your cultural life, God's pretty much giving you over. So it was kind of almost amazing that they were able to find 4 men who still actually had God at heart in the city of Jerusalem when time came to take them out to Babylon. And it's somewhat interesting that the wording in Daniel chapter 1, verse 3, where Ashpenaz was told to choose, quote, some of the Israelites who were of royal and noble descent, end quote. That wording implies that far more than 4 were chosen, yet these 4 are all we ever hear about. And I expected it was because they were the only ones who left who were the followers of the Lord. So when you think about it, can you imagine being offered the same food and drink as the king? With all of these men being of royal and noble birth, I suspect a few of them have missed all that many meals growing up. But, for me, I will admit that good food is a weakness. That I have to continually watch my own self to keep from overindulging. I probably would have been tempted very strongly to have accepted the offer and just said, we're no longer at a place where I can maintain these, directions or this adherence, to the dietary restrictions that the law had put on us. I can't do that. But these four men actually had the intestinal fortitude to look a king in the eye and say, no, we're not going to, well, kind of by proxy, but, to look the king in the eye and say, no, we're not going to defile ourselves for you. Later on, they'll actually look at me and say the same thing. So the third thing that they have, or that Daniel had in common with Christ, was intelligence and wisdom. Jesus showed wisdom far beyond what one would expect of a mortal and regular man. From the time that he was 11 and had stayed behind to learn in the temple to the end of the Sermon on the Mount, where in Matthew chapter 7, verses 28 through 9, Matthew says the crowds were amazed by his teaching because he taught them like one who had authority, not like their experts in the law. Daniel's confidence and faith allowed him to do the right thing, and so God increased his wisdom. So with proof that Daniel was a man of God, that he had faith and confidence in that faith, Daniel was taken into Nebuchadnezzar's service. The next thing we know, Nebuchadnezzar has a series of dreams that were extremely upsetting to him. He wanted the dreams explained just as Pharaoh did from Joseph over 1,000 years ago. Nebuchadnezzar did something clever, though. He knew that anyone could come up with a rationale for these dreams once the dreams were revealed to him, actually, I was going to say to him or her, but at this point I think there were only male magicians and wise guys in Nebuchadnezzar's court. So he asked the wise men to describe the dream first. Once you tell me what dream I had, then we can talk about the interpretation. And the wise men in his court thought that was cheating. They said, no matter who he is, no man born of woman can know this. So Nebuchadnezzar gave an order to put the whole lot of them to death. When Daniel saw that he was about to be lumped in with the rest of the wise men and executed, he requested some time to speak to the king. And just as important, when he requested this time to speak to the king, in Daniel chapter 2, verse 18, he asked Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah to, quote, pray for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery so that he and his friends would not be destroyed by the rest of the wise, or with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. So Daniel is then taken to the king, where he describes the dreams and their interpretation to Nebuchadnezzar. In Daniel chapter 2, verse 28, Daniel explicitly gives credit to the God in heaven who reveals mysteries for the ability to describe the dreams and their interpretation. And in chapter 4, or in the fourth thing that Daniel displayed that we see in Christ is humility. Jesus was famously humble. From ministering to lepers and tax collectors on one hand to washing the feet of his disciples on the other, Jesus never, ever, ever put himself first. If he had put himself first, he would have said, there's no reason for me to sacrifice myself to save a lot of you when you all are the ones that have sinned. But he said on many occasions that the first will be last and the last will be first in the kingdom of heaven. And Daniel was the same way. As long as nothing that he was being asked or told to do required to do went against the law or the will of God, Daniel and his companions were humble and served their overlords to the best of their abilities. After the fall of Babylon and during the rule of Darius, Daniel was once again brought in to be one of the three supervisors who were going to be in charge of the entire kingdom and answerable only to Darius. So Daniel humbled himself and worked according to the will of God, earning each day's pay by doing the absolute best job he could. He was doing such a good job that everybody else was trying to find a way to get rid of him because he was making them look bad. I've seen that recently in more than one workplace in my career. Stop doing such a good job. You're making the rest of us look bad. But in Daniel chapter 6, verse 4, they were unable to find any such damaging evidence because he was trustworthy and had no negligence or corruption. And in Daniel chapter 6, verse 5, they acknowledged that they would be unable to find any pretext against this man Daniel, unless it was in connection with the law of his God. And so that's actually what they tried to do. At that point, in Daniel chapter 6, a group of them go to Darius and tell Darius to write down a directive. And what's written in a directive by, Persian law, I guess, could not be changed at that point. And he said, or they asked Darius to make a proclamation that they were to pray to pray to Darius. It was 3 times a day, I think it was. And they walked in and purposefully laid a trap for Daniel, who said, "I'm sorry, but I'm not going to be doing that. I'm going to be up here praying to my God." And they brought a complaint against Daniel to Darius and said, "You wrote this in the law, and the law, can't be changed. And so look at what happened." And that's the point. Have y'all ever heard about that comparison between involvement and commitment? There's a difference between bacon and eggs. The hen is involved, but the pig is committed. But, at that point, Daniel was committed to his faith, and because of that, it ended up being that the rest of the people who were bringing accusations against him were the ones that ended up being executed because of this. So, and once we get past the history of Daniel here, we are going to start looking at prophecies. So there's kind of 2 chunks of prophecy in the book. There are prophecies that were given as dreams to the kings that Daniel interpreted that were for those kings and for that kingdom. Then there was a set of prophecies that were given to Daniel in the last half of the book of Daniel, where we have angels interpreting the visions for Daniel that were given to Daniel. So, as I started looking into the history of the book of Daniel, I kind of had to laugh in a way, because the 2 main prophecies in the back of the book of Daniel ended up being so precise that there were people that were using them as arguments as to why Daniel couldn't have been the guy who wrote the book of Daniel. He got it so right all the way up to about 150 BC that there was no way any man could have known that all that was going to happen. And so that brings us to the fact that God gave him the prophecy, but for some reason some folks aren't able to accept that. So, I'm going to go into the rest of this lesson with the caveat that I am not an Old Testament prophetic scholar. I have studied, I've studied a little bit about this, but I am not going to say what I'm giving to you now, is the gospel truth and is the only way to interpret these prophecies. I'd be happy to sit down and study with any one of you, that had questions or concerns, or, is just curious about this and wants to get to know it better. So, the first one we're going to start with is the prophecy of 70 weeks in Daniel chapter 9. So at the beginning of chapter 9, Daniel was reading the prophecy given to Jeremiah, saying that Jerusalem was to be abandoned for 70 years. And at that point, Daniel looked down at his Apple Watch and said, "Hey, this is about 69 and a half years." And so he started praying and fasting to the Lord, confessing the sin of Judah and Jerusalem, and acknowledging that the Lord absolutely had the right to punish the kingdom of Judah for the sins that they had committed. During this prayer, in verse 20, Gabriel comes to Daniel with a vision and says, 70 weeks have been determined concerning your people and your holy city, to put an end to rebellion, to bring sin to completion, to atone for iniquity, to bring in perpetual righteousness, to seal up the prophetic vision, and to anoint the most holy place. So know and understand from the beginning of the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until an anointed one, a prince, appears, there will be a period of 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will again be built with a plaza and moat, but in distressful times. Now after 62 weeks, an anointed one will be cut off and have nothing. As for the city and the sanctuary, the people of the coming prince will destroy them, but his end will come speedily like a flood. Until the war has been decreed, there will be destruction. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of that week he will bring sacrifices and offerings to a halt. On the wing of abomination will come one who destroys until the decreed end is poured out on the one who destroys. So this is actually one of the more direct prophecies of the birth and death of Christ in the Old Testament. In verse 24, the direct translation of 70 weeks is actually 77s. And if you know anything at all about biblical numerology, such that specific numbers are chosen by God and by the structure of the Gospels and the Bible to represent things, the number 7 appears repeatedly, and it appears in the context of completion. This is God's number, the number 7. So we have 10 sevens of sevens, which ends out coming out to, when you do the math and multiply, assuming I can still remember how to do it from 3rd grade, this leads us to about 490 items. So the thought there is that the sevens that are being referred to in this, the 77s, each one of those sevens is not a day but a year, which leads to the concept of 490 years. So within that 490 years, we need to know from verse 25 when the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem was issued. The best guess, according to the guys that I was studying from and studying with, is that we could look in Ezra chapter 7, verses 11 through 26. In summary, the king Artaxerxes gave Ezra an order concerning worship in the temple, along with the authority to draw up to 100 talents of silver, which was real money even back then, 100 cores of wheat, 100 baths of wine, 100 baths of olive oil, and unlimited salt to use in temple worship. This order exempted the Levites, musicians, doorkeepers, servants, and attendants at the temple from paying taxes. And finally, in verses 25 and 26, Artaxerxes brings the law of Moses up to par with the law of the Persians, so that from that point forward, the law of Moses took hold officially with legal force in the nation of Israel, or the nation of Judah. So the best date we have for when that order was given, or when that letter was written, was right around 457 BC. So if you do some math in terms of the length of a year at that point, they're using lunar years as opposed to solar years, and you do the math, you carry the 12 and add the 5, you come up with the end of that, the end of that 490 years being right around 27 AD, give or take. And that's actually pretty close. That's certainly, there's a very small error bar there, but that's certainly within the, I think, margin of error for right around the time that Christ started his public ministry. And from that, we can look at it and say that the anointed one will be cut off and will have nothing. Could certainly, I think, certainly indicates that the anointed one, the Christ, Christ meaning the anointed one, will be cut off from the cross and will have nothing more to do, with the world, or will be cut off by the cross. Will have nothing more to do. So Daniel is clearly looking forward, with Gabriel's help, to the coming of the anointed one, the Son of God. Now, the last one that we'll touch on briefly, but I'm not really going to go into a whole lot of time, is the future history given to Daniel, starting in Daniel chapter 11. The reason I'm not going to go into it is that it's primarily secular. It's effectively giving a history of, the nation of Judea, or the kingdom of Judea, being in the middle with a bunch of wars between Greece, the Medes, the Persians, Babylon, Egypt, and how those are going to go and what's going to happen with those and how it's all going to end out. And it really effectively gives the history of the nation of Israel from the time that the prophecy or that the prophets stop and we enter that intertestamental period. It really is just giving the history of that intertestamental period, call it a couple hundred years early. And as for those that had thought that it gave a history that was too precise to be, for the book of Daniel to have been written when it was, we've actually got evidence through Flavius Josephus again, that historian, had actually said, yeah, we've got evidence of this book being read back in 360 or so BC. So, I don't know what you can say, but it was as accurate as it went. So, Daniel's life and values were a preview of the life and values of Jesus, with both of them leading lives of virtue, humility, and faith. And Daniel ultimately was looking forward even more explicitly through his prophecies to the birth and the death and the resurrection of the Christ. So if you are here and need to experience that Christ, to be washed, we have water here. We'd love to wash away your sins. We'd love to welcome you as a new brother or sister. So if you need to do that, or if you need the prayers of the congregation or to speak to an elder, we invite you to come forward as we stand and sing the invitations.